This depiction of Jesus as Good Shepherd comes to us from the early 4th century. What I'd like you to do is look carefully at two other images of Jesus. One of them, again, is Jesus as Good Shepherd, that come from the following 2 centuries to document the way in which images, depictions of Jesus actually change. This one, first of all, is made out of fresco, and that's one of the changes that will be very evident to us. Okay, this, early 4th century, here we go. This piece comes to us, figure 824 in our textbook, from the early 5th century in Rome, and it is a depiction that's made out of mosaics. One of the things immediately that you need to recognize is that this cost more to make. We're no longer looking at a work of art that was made for, should I say, underprivileged Christians, Christians from the lower ranks of society. Now we're dealing with a work of art that was put in place with a hefty financial support behind it. So the material, in this case mosaic, which is made up of tiny bits of marble, ceramic, or glass. For the early Christians, particularly the reflective surface mattered to them as they placed their their mosaics up high on the walls of their churches, sometimes also decorating the ceilings. Okay, this is a 5th century piece, and it does depict Jesus as Good Shepherd. It is a very transitional piece, though. It's moving away from the image we saw in the 4th century, the 100 years earlier, essentially, where Jesus was depicted as one of us, as a very approachable shepherd who was caring for his flock. So where do we see the change occur? Well, we see it in the composition, and we also see it in the way in which Jesus is depicted. The composition now is becoming relatively formal. It's moving toward rigid symmetry. Jesus is shown in the center. Yes, he twists a little bit, but take a look at those sheep. The sheep on both sides of Jesus have shifted into shapes that look like triangles. So over here we have one triangle. Over here we have another triangle. Both sets of triangles incorporate sheep, all of them looking in the direction of Jesus, which makes this a relatively closed and orderly composition. Now this is looking back a little bit to the ancient world. Think of the mosaics you might find at Pompeii. There are some plants. We've got a blue sky. There's also some shading on the sheep. And if we go right here, you can see that. So that we're making reference to the natural world. Go down here, you can see some shadows under the feet of our sheep. But it is breaking away from naturalism and moving in the direction of becoming formal and, as we'll see shortly, somewhat rigid, as the artist rejects the ordinary world in which we live. Okay, so the 1.1, the composition has changed here, the style has changed, as well as the material. In addition to that, the way Jesus looks has changed. He is now dressed not as a simple shepherd at all, but he's dressed in gold and purple. Those are the colors of the emperor, or colors that are associated with royalty. He also has a halo, indicating his divine nature. In addition to showing Jesus now as I'm going to say a more remote figure, because he's really not one of us anymore, he is not making any real contact with his sheep. He's reaching his hand out, and he's given maybe a little coochie-coochie-coo under the chin of the sheep, but that's it. He is not looking at them, and he is not holding them. So we're beginning to see a gentle distancing of Jesus from his flock, a remoteness that is entering the images as Jesus is beginning to belong more to the realm of the spirit than to the realm of the physical or of the earth. This is a detail just to get a look at the little pieces that make up a mosaic. And in particular, if you go over here to the detail on the right, you can see that it would be very difficult time-consuming and expensive to create a mosaic. It's a little bit like putting a picture puzzle together. Each of the pieces has to be incorporated to create a whole. By its very nature, also, mosaics tend toward abstraction because it's very tough to create subtle shading in mosaic creations. If you go over to our sheep, you're going to see the artist is attempting to give us shadow and attempting to give us probably texture on the body of the sheep, but you can also pick up how very difficult it is to do. So mosaics, by their nature, tend to move the art form away from naturalism. By the time we reach the 6th century, and this particular work was created early in the 6th century in 504, it is figure 826 in our textbook. By the time we get here, the image of Jesus has changed dramatically from what it was back in the catacombs. The humble shepherd, one of his people, essentially, very approachable, very down to earth, wearing a simple shepherd's garb. By the time we get to the 6th century, Jesus is now depicted as a royal, as a king, but a king of heaven. He's wearing a robe that is largely purple, and the color purple is the color specifically associated with emperors and with royalty. It is trimmed in gold. And if you go up and look at his halo, he still has a halo, but the halo now has a cross form on it, hinting at the cross, but it is jeweled. So what that suggests really is a crown. Jesus then is depicted as a heavenly ruler, parallel to the earthly ruler who almost certainly would have paid for this object to be placed in a church. Jesus is also located in a celestial realm. The background is gold. We don't have a blue sky anymore. Yeah, okay, we have a couple trees and a couple rocks, but they're not very convincing. They're not very lifelike. They're not very naturalistic. They seem to have been put in against the gold sky to essentially frame the composition and maintain it as a closed image. The figures are also enclosed in an increasingly shallow space. Everything's getting flatter. And the work of art, which is very symmetrical, it's closed, it's symmetrical, is also one that depicts hierarchic scale. The figure of Jesus, who steps relatively forward compared to his disciples, is also certainly larger than his disciples. And his halo goes way up to the top of the mosaic image. The figures behind him, 2 on each side, also are really deferential. They kind of nod their heads, turn their heads down a little bit, and they do not make direct contact with the viewer. It's only Jesus who does this. So the composition has become increasingly formal, and Jesus is shown in an increasingly royal and spiritual way, removed from the daily existence that we participate in. It's clear that the artist is moving further and further away from naturalism, and the easiest way to see that is with the gold sky. But I have a couple other things I want to point out. One of them is those loaves and fishes, and this, of course, is one of Jesus's early public miracles with his disciples, where he multiplies the fish and the bread that he has to feed the multitude. Just take a look at Jesus's left hand and the fish. If we go over here, I think we have a serious case of floating fish. Jesus is not actually holding those fish. Yes, I know that this is a miracle, so it is beyond the laws of human understanding. But the artist is also avoiding a naturalistic portrayal. So we continue to move further and further away from the naturalism that we kind of come to expect way back in its roots with the ancient Greeks. Okay, the same is going to be true. Look at the bread. The loaves seem to extend miraculously out from the hand of Jesus. Impossible in terms of the laws of physics. Okay, you can argue that those are references to the miraculous nature of the event, but I have another one that I think is going to point out that the artist is really no longer as concerned with naturalism. And that is, there is actually a body part that is missing. If you take a look at the disciples who stand behind Jesus with his outstretched arms with the bread and the fish, and you look closely, you will determine that the figures on the side of Jesus's right arm, there are two guys, and darn it, there are only three legs. So what we are missing here is actually one leg of one of the disciples. Accuracy in terms of anatomy, as well as other details, the natural setting, no longer matter to our artist. Our artist now is creating a very spiritual image, a remote image, and this definitely documents the change in our relationship to Jesus. So we do have to ask the question, how did this happen? Let's go back to our timeline to see if we can't explain how the image of Jesus changed so rapidly in Rome and determined a pattern for the depiction of Jesus for the next several hundred years. Constantine, we remember in 313, is going to allow the practice of all religions in public. That was probably specifically aimed at allowing Christians to practice, but it also allowed Jews to practice their monotheistic faith as well. So this begins officially in 313. Constantine then in 330 founds a city in the east, Constantinople, and will have a gradual shift of power and wealth to the east. In 380, the western portion, and that really does refer to the territory of Rome itself, including the Italian peninsula. Christianity there will become the official state religion in the Roman world in the year 380. By 391, the same folks are going to ban or outlaw the practice of paganism in public. That's exactly what used to be the case for Christianity. We're talking about a change that occurs rapidly, just over 75 years, from the Edict of Milan to the banning of the practice of the ancient religion entirely. Along with this, in the year 394, the games are banned because those games were generally held in honor of the Greek and Roman gods. So they had a religious association, so the games themselves also had to go. In this now fully Christian world, something extraordinary and terrifying happens in the year 410, and that is the city of Rome is going to be sacked by these quote-unquote barbarians from outside, in particular the folks who are known as the Visigoths. But they're going to come in and they're going to lay waste to the city of Rome. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. If you are a Christian in Rome, particularly if you're a recently converted Christian, what are you going to think? You're going to think that the ancient gods are mad, that they've been abandoned. You're also going to think that this Jesus guy isn't very good because he didn't do anything to protect you. So there is a move afoot to turn away from Christianity, certainly to question it deeply as a failed faith. One of the figures of the church, whose name is Augustine, steps forward to counter this reaction and writes a book, and I do want you to at least recognize the title of the book. It's called City of God, and with that single document, Augustine moves human beings from reason and humanism, and that was the foundation of the ancient world, to faith and spirituality, which is the foundation of the Middle Ages. In this text, Augustine moves us away from reason toward faith by claiming that, don't you worry about what happens to the world down here. It doesn't matter. What you need to care about is the city of God. The city of God is perfect. The city of humans is imperfect and sinful. You need God's help to be able to leave behind the concerns of this world to go to the next one, the heavens. Augustine paints a picture of humans as sinful and their world as unworthy. Let me leave you with this quote from Augustine on Adam and Eve, our parents. Quote, "The sin which they committed was so great that it impaired all human nature, in the sense that the nature has been transmitted to posterity with a propensity to sin and a necessity to die." What a pessimistic view of us and of our world. This means we must depend on God for everything, that we are unworthy, and God will become increasingly remote from us, as will be depicted in images of Jesus, and that accounts for the change.